I never thought my son, an Army captain, coming home for a surprise visit would lead to me systematically dismantling our entire homeowners association. But then again, I'd never met Brenda. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from, because you are not going to believe the level of suburban warfare that a single concerned neighbor can unleash. This story gets pretty crazy, so buckle up. It all started on a Tuesday until about 3:14 p.m., shaping up to be a perfect example of why I'd chosen this quiet, leafy subdivision for my retirement. I'm a retired civil engineer. For 40 years I designed and oversaw the construction of municipal infrastructure, roads, bridges, water systems. My life was about order, precision, and rules that made logical sense. I loved it. Retirement for me was the reward, a life with fewer blueprints and more iced tea. My wife, Sarah, was inside preparing what she called a welcome home feast, and I was on the front porch, enjoying the blissful quiet, when a familiar, slightly battered Ford F-150 rumbled down the street. My son, David. He was supposed to be on base 1,000 miles away, but he'd managed to snag a 72-hour pass and decided to surprise us. I felt a surge of pride and happiness that warmed me more than the afternoon sun. He pulled up to the curb directly in front of our house. Not in the driveway, because my car was there and Sarah's was in the garage. He was just running in. He hopped out, a wide grin on his face, looking every bit the off-duty soldier in a simple t-shirt, jeans, and a baseball cap. He hadn't even made it to the walkway before the attack began. From across the street, a figure emerged from a house that was a monument to beige conformity. This was Brenda, our HOA president. She moved with the predatory grace of a golf cart driving velociraptor. She was a woman in her late 50s who dressed in what I can only describe as aggressively expensive leisure wear, today featuring a turquoise tracksuit that shimmered with malicious intent. In her manicured hand, she clutched a clipboard, her weapon of choice. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice carrying an unnerving combination of forced politeness and undisguised accusation. David, mid-stride, stopped and turned. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone friendly. "This is a residential street," Brenda announced, as if revealing a state secret. "Parking on the street is for temporary guests only, and you need to have a permit displayed for any vehicle parked for more than 2 hours." David glanced at his truck, then back at her. "I'll probably be gone in less than 2 hours," he said with a shrug. "I'm just visiting my folks." He gestured toward me on the porch. Brenda's eyes flicked to me, then back to my son, her expression curdling with suspicion. She sized up his dusty work boots, his older model truck, and the faded logo on his cap. Her mind, clearly a whirlwind of suburban paranoia, leaped to the only conclusion it could. "We've had a number of break-ins in the area recently," she said, her voice dripping with insinuation. "Unmarked commercial vehicles, contractors, casing homes, you understand." I'd had enough. I stood up and walked to the edge of the porch. "Brenda, this is my son, David. He's visiting. He'll move the truck in a minute." She gave me a thin reptilian smile. "Henry, of course, but the rules are the rules. They apply to everyone. We can't have strange vehicles cluttering up the curb appeal. It lowers property values." She made a show of scribbling something on her clipboard. "I'll have to document this. First-time warnings are usually verbal, but given the circumstances." David, who had dealt with situations far more stressful than a power-tripping HOA president, just held up his hands. "No problem, I'll move it right now. Just saying hi to my dad." But Brenda was no longer listening. She had escalated the situation in her own mind, from a simple parking infraction to a full-blown threat to her personal kingdom. "I don't appreciate your tone," she snapped at my son. "And frankly, I feel unsafe. I'm calling the authorities to report a suspicious individual." Before I could even process the sheer absurdity of her statement, she had her phone out, stabbing at the screen with a perfectly manicured finger. I looked at David. His easygoing smile had vanished, replaced by a look of weary disbelief. He'd served 2 tours in Afghanistan, dealt with actual threats, and now he was being treated like a potential cat burglar because he parked a Ford in front of his own family's home. The next 10 minutes were a masterclass in bureaucratic overreach. Brenda stood on the sidewalk, phone to her ear, providing a loud, dramatic description of David as if he were a one-man crime wave. Yes, he's very aggressive. His truck looks very out of place. I'm the HOA president, and I have a responsibility to my community. 2 police cars arrived with surprising speed. 2 officers, a man and a woman, got out. They were professional, calm, but they had to follow procedure. They approached David, who was now leaning against his truck, arms crossed, the picture of patience. "Sir, we had a call about a suspicious person," the male officer said, his eyes scanning the scene. "Ma'am, is this the individual?" he asked Brenda. "Yes, officer," she chirped, practically vibrating with self-importance. He refused to identify himself and became belligerent when I informed him of our community parking regulations. A complete and utter lie. My blood began to simmer. The officer turned back to David. "Sir, can I see some identification, please?" "Of course, officer," David said. He reached for his wallet, pulled out his driver's license, and handed it over. As he did, he also pulled out his military ID card and handed that over as well. "Just in case you need it." The officer took both cards. He looked at the driver's license, then at the military ID. His entire posture changed. It wasn't dramatic, but it was immediate. The formal procedural stiffness melted away, replaced by a quiet, profound respect. He looked from the ID to my son's face. "Captain Miller," he said, reading the rank. "Thank you for your service." Brenda, who had crept closer to peer over the officer's shoulder, saw it. I watched her face as her eyes registered the official United States Army identification. The triumphant, smug smirk didn't just fade, it froze. It was like watching a statue being carved out of ice in real time. Her jaw went slack. Her eyes, wide with shock, darted from the ID to David's face, as if trying to reconcile the transient contractor from her paranoid fantasy with the decorated military officer standing before her. The female officer, who had seen the ID as well, gave Brenda a look that could have stripped paint. "Ma'am," she said, her voice laced with professional disdain, "this man is Captain David Miller of the United States Army. He's visiting his father. You called us out here for a parking dispute." Brenda stammered, "Well, I didn't know. The truck, he was being, the rules." The male officer handed David his IDs back. "Sorry to have bothered you, Captain. Welcome home." He tipped his hat to me. "Sir." Then he turned to Brenda, his voice dropping to a low, stern tone. "Ma'am, misusing police resources is a serious issue. I'd advise you to think very carefully before you call 911 again over a parking spot." The officers got back in their cars and left. The street was quiet again, but the air was thick with humiliation, all of it Brenda's. She stood there for a moment, her turquoise tracksuit suddenly looking cheap and garish. She shot me a look of pure, unadulterated venom, a promise of future retribution, before turning on her heel and marching back to her beige fortress. As I watched her go, I knew this wasn't over. I knew that in her small, tyrannical mind, she hadn't been wrong, she had been embarrassed. And for a person like Brenda, embarrassment wasn't a lesson, it was a declaration of war. I looked at my son, who just shook his head and let out a long sigh. "Well," he said, "that was a welcome." And I thought to myself, she has no idea who she just picked a fight with. She messed with my son. Now, she was going to have to deal with his father, the retired civil engineer, who suddenly had a new, all-consuming project, the complete and total deconstruction of Brenda's empire. The first volley in Brenda's retaliatory campaign arrived 3 days later. It came in the form of a crisp, cream-colored envelope, embossed with the HOA logo, slid unceremoniously through our mail slot. Inside was not one, but 4 separate violation notices. It was a masterpiece of petty vengeance. First, the color of our mailbox, a standard black that had been there for 15 years, was now deemed an unapproved shade of matte, a violation of Architectural Guideline 7.3b. Fine, $50. Second, a small, whimsical garden gnome that Sarah had placed by the hydrangeas was cited as unauthorized and tacky lawn statuary, a violation of Aesthetic Code 12.5. Fine, $75. Third, my lawn, which I had mowed 2 days prior, was measured. I can only imagine Brenda crawling on our lawn with a ruler rand found to be 1/4 of an inch over the mandated 3-inch maximum height. Fine, $25. The final notice was the pièce de résistance, a $100 fine for creating a public nuisance, with the description simply stating, incident on Tuesday, 3:15 p.m. A clear reference to David's visit. Sarah was furious. "This is insane, Henry. She's punishing us because she made a fool of herself. A tacky gnome? She has 3 plastic flamingos and a concrete dolphin by her bird bath." I, however, felt a strange sense of calm settle over me. Anger is an inefficient fuel. It burns hot and fast. What I was feeling was colder, more sustainable. It was the familiar, focused drive I used to get when faced with a complex engineering problem, like retrofitting a seismically unsound bridge or untangling a hopelessly flawed municipal water plan. Brenda wasn't just a neighborhood bully. She was a poorly designed system destined for catastrophic failure, and I was going to be the one to draft the demolition plans. "Don't worry about it, honey," I said, laying the violation notices on the kitchen counter. "I'll handle it." My first move wasn't to fight the fines. That would be playing her game, a whack-a-mole of her own making where she could invent new rules as fast as I could contest them. No, the solution was to remove the game master. I needed to understand the system she was abusing. In my old job, you never started digging until you had the blueprints. I needed the HOA's blueprints. That afternoon, I drafted an email to the official HOA board address, which I knew went directly to Brenda. It was polite, professional, and unassailable. I formally requested, as a homeowner in good standing, electronic copies of several key documents, citing my rights under our state's property code. I asked for the complete and current covenants, conditions and restrictions, CC, HOA, the HOA bylaws, all board meeting minutes from the past 5 years, including executive sessions, and, most critically, the complete financial records for the same 5-year period, including annual budgets, balance sheets, income statements, and a detailed general ledger. Her reply came within the hour. It was dripping with condescension. "Dear Mr. Miller," it began, "we have received your extensive request. Please be advised that compiling such a large volume of documents requires significant administrative effort. There will be a document processing fee of $250, and the expected time frame for delivery is 30 to 45 business days, pending board approval of the resource allocation." She was stonewalling, creating illegal barriers to entry. A processing fee that high was unheard of and likely prohibited, and the timeline was a joke. She was betting I'd give up. It was a fatal miscalculation. She saw me as a retired old man. She didn't see the man who once spent 18 months in a legal battle with a concrete supplier who tried to use substandard aggregate in a highway overpass. I won that battle, and the only thing I had to drink was lukewarm coffee from a thermos. This was personal. I had iced tea. I spent the next hour at my desk, drafting my response. It was not an email. It was a formal letter, printed on high-quality paper, which I sent via certified mail with return receipt requested. In it, I politely informed her that our state's Nonprofit Corporation Act, which governs most HOAs, required the production of such documents within 10 business days. I cited the specific statute number. I also informed her that the Act stipulated that the association could only charge for the actual cost of copying, which, for electronic documents, was effectively zero. I mentioned that failure to comply could result in a court order compelling production, as well as statutory penalties and the recovery of my legal fees. I never once used the word lawyer, but its ghost haunted every sentence. I concluded by stating I looked forward to receiving the documents within the legally mandated 10-day period. For 6 days, there was silence. I imagined Brenda stewing, consulting her board of enablers, trying to find a way out of it. On the 7th day, a notification appeared in my inbox. It was from a large file-sharing service. The subject line was a terse: "Requested HOA documents." No message, no "Dear Mr. Miller," just a link. I smiled. The first retaining wall had crumbled. For the next 2 weeks, my retirement was put on hold. My study became a command center. I had one monitor displaying the HOA's budget spreadsheets, another with the meeting minutes, and a third with the CCRs. I imported the financial data into professional accounting software. I printed out the subdivision plat maps I had from when we first bought the house. I was in my element. It was a beautiful, intricate puzzle of mismanagement. Slowly, patterns began to emerge. The meeting minutes were the first red flag. They were suspiciously clean. Every vote was recorded as unanimous. There were never any discussions, debates, or dissenting opinions noted. It was the minutes of a dictatorship, not a community board. Then I got into the financials, and the real rot began to show. The budget was riddled with vague, oversized line items. Community beautification projects, $25,000. Administrative consulting, $15. Seasonal landscaping enhancements, $18,000. These were on top of the regular contracted services for lawn care and maintenance. It was a slush fund, hidden in plain sight. I started cross-referencing invoices against the general ledger. The administrative consulting fees were paid to a firm that, after a quick search, I found was owned by Brenda's brother-in-law. The work described on the invoices was comically vague: strategic oversight services and procedural review. But the real gem was the landscaping. The big checks for seasonal landscaping enhancements weren't going to the reputable local company that cut our grass. They were going to a different entity entirely, a company called Brenda's Beautiful Blooms. The name was so brazen it was almost insulting. I sat back in my chair and let out a low whistle. This woman wasn't just a petty tyrant. She was a clumsy crook. She had to believe that no one would ever check. Her arrogance was her greatest vulnerability. I now had a name. I had a thread to pull, and I had a feeling that if I pulled it hard enough, Brenda's entire carefully curated world was going to unravel. Finding a company named Brenda's Beautiful Blooms in the HOA's ledger was like finding a signed confession at a crime scene. It was so audacious, so utterly devoid of subtlety, that it was almost beautiful in its foolishness. My next step was to move from digital archaeology to real-world investigation. I needed to prove that this company was nothing more than a ghost, a shell corporation designed to funnel HOA money directly into Brenda's pocket. My first port of call was the state's official business registry website. I typed in Brenda's Beautiful Blooms. The result popped up instantly. It was registered as a sole proprietorship. The address listed was a P.O. box at a pack-and-ship store in the next town over. And the name of the registered agent, the sole proprietor? It wasn't Brenda's current married name. It was Brenda Tillotson, her maiden name. She'd made a token effort to obscure the connection, but for anyone with 5 minutes and an internet connection, it was a flashing neon sign pointing directly at her. This was the smoking gun. This was fraud. But I needed more. Proving she owned the company was one thing. I needed to prove that the company did no actual work. My engineering background taught me the value of exhaustive documentation. Over the next week, I became the neighborhood's most dedicated photographer. I walked the common areas, the small park, the green belt along the creek, the landscaped islands and the cul-de-sacs with my phone, taking hundreds of photos. The areas, supposedly enhanced by Brenda's Beautiful Blooms, were, to put it mildly, pathetic. A few sad-looking azaleas that had been there for years, some patches of mulch that were thin and weedy, and a collection of browning, neglected flower beds. I compared my photos with older pictures from the neighborhood's social media page. The enhancements were non-existent. The common areas looked worse than they had 3 years ago. Yet, according to the invoices, Brenda had paid her own company over $80,000 during that time for seasonal planting, horticultural upgrades, and aesthetic maintenance. While documenting the state of the landscaping, I remembered the subdivision plats I had in my study. On a whim, I pulled them out again. These are the official maps, filed with the county, that lay out every property line, every road, and crucially, every easement. An easement is a legal right for a third party, usually a utility company or the city, to use a portion of a property for a specific purpose, like running water lines or electrical cables. Building a permanent structure on an easement is a huge no-no. I spread the large map across my dining room table and started tracing the lines with my finger. Our neighborhood was crisscrossed with public utility easements, or PUEs. most of them running along the back of the properties. I followed the one that ran behind Brenda's house, and then my heart gave a little thump. According to the official county surveyor's map, a 10-foot wide PUE cut directly across the back corner of her property. And sitting squarely in the middle of that easement, based on my visual estimation and its relation to the property line, was Brenda's pride and joy. A very large, very permanent-looking white gazebo. This was the structure she constantly lorded over everyone else. It was her showcase, the backdrop for her Garden of the Month photos in the HOA newsletter, and it was completely illegal. It was an encroachment that the utility company could demand be torn down tomorrow at the HOA's expense if she argued it was a community-approved feature. This wasn't just a rule violation, it was a massive, undisclosed liability for every single homeowner. Brenda, in her quest for a perfect garden, had exposed the entire community to significant financial risk. Armed with evidence of financial malfeasance and a major legal liability, I knew I couldn't act alone. This couldn't be perceived as a personal vendetta from the guy whose son she'd harassed. This had to be a community movement. I needed allies. I started with George, a retired accountant who lived 2 doors down. George was a gentle soul who had been on the receiving end of Brenda's tyranny for years over the state of his bird feeder. I caught him while he was watering his petunias. I started cautiously, asking him if he felt the HOA fees were providing good value. That opened the floodgates. He complained about the deteriorating common areas and the constant, nitpicking fines. "I feel like I'm paying for the privilege of being scolded," he lamented. I showed him a few of my photos of the neglected flower beds. Then I showed him a redacted copy of an invoice for Brenda's Beautiful Blooms for $4,500 for spring planting. I didn't tell him who owned the company yet. I just let him connect the dots. $4,500 for what? A dozen dead marigolds? He sputtered. George was in. He told me about a few other neighbors who were fed up. There was Maria, a young mother fined because her children's chalk drawings on the sidewalk were deemed graffiti, and there was Tom, a car enthusiast who was in a perpetual war with Brenda over the classic Mustang he kept immaculate in his own garage. I set up a secret meeting in my living room. I presented my findings calmly and methodically, laying out the documents on the coffee table. When I finally revealed that Brenda's Beautiful Blooms was registered to Brenda herself, there was a collective gasp. George, the retired accountant, looked physically ill. "That's embezzlement," he whispered. "It's straight-up embezzlement." Then I showed them the plat map and the photo of Brenda's gazebo sitting on the public utility easement. Maria, who was a paralegal, understood the implications instantly. "Oh, she is in so much trouble," she said, a slow smile spreading across her face. "That's a ticking time bomb. Our insurance would never cover a claim if something happened because of that illegal structure." We formed a small, covert council of war. We agreed on a strategy. The annual HOA meeting was in 3 weeks. It was the one time of the year Brenda couldn't completely control the agenda. According to the bylaws I had practically memorized, any homeowner could add an item to the agenda for discussion if they submitted it in writing at least 2 weeks prior. Our little group drafted the request that evening. We kept it deliberately vague and professional to avoid tipping our hand. We requested that the following item be added to the agenda: a homeowner-led review of board fiduciary duty, contractual procedures, and management of association assets. It sounded boring. It sounded bureaucratic. There was no legal way Brenda could refuse to add it to the agenda. She would assume it was me, whining about my gnome fine. She would be completely unprepared for the full-scale audit I was about to perform in front of the entire neighborhood. We were no longer just a few disgruntled residents. We were a conspiracy, and we had our target in sight. The weeks leading up to the annual HOA meeting were filled with a quiet, electric tension. Our small group communicated through a secure chat app, sharing observations and words of encouragement. Brenda, oblivious, continued her reign of terror. She sent out a pre-meeting newsletter filled with smiling photos of herself next to wilting flower beds, congratulating the board on another year of fiscal responsibility and community enhancement. It was a work of fiction so audacious it belonged on the bestseller list. As per the bylaws, she was forced to include our agenda item in the official meeting notice. She buried it at the very end, right before open forum, and titled it, Discussion of Resident Concerns, H. Miller. The parenthetical was a classic Brenda Mouvain attempt to frame my presentation as the solitary grievance of one disgruntled old man. It was perfect. Her arrogance was setting the stage for her own downfall better than I ever could. The night before the meeting, my study looked like a lawyer's office preparing for a landmark case. I had compiled everything into a clear, concise, and utterly damning presentation. I had a PowerPoint deck ready to go, complete with high-resolution photos, scanned documents with key sections highlighted, and simple, easy-to-read charts that visualized the flow of money from the HOA accounts to Brenda's beautiful blooms. I had created a summary paqueta, 10-page dossier of pure fact sand printed 60 copies, one for every household in the subdivision. George had the copies, ready to distribute them at the precise moment. Maria had reviewed the bylaws again and coached us on the exact wording for a motion to remove a board member. We were prepared, we were organized, we were a well-oiled machine of righteous indignation. The meeting was held in the drab multi-purpose room of the local library. The air was stale with the smell of old books and institutional cleaner. About 50 homeowners were there, a much higher turnout than usual, likely due to a year's worth of pent-up frustration. Brenda and her 3 bored cronies sat at a folding table at the front, looking regal and deeply bored. Brenda was wearing a severe-looking navy blue blazer with shoulders so padded she looked like she was preparing for a football game. A large, gaudy pearl necklace was clasped around her throat. She surveyed the room with the air of a queen addressing her long-suffering subjects. The meeting began. Brenda moved through the first few agenda items with brisk, dismissive efficiency. The treasurer, a nervous man named Arthur who always looked like he'd just lost his car keys, read a bafflingly opaque financial summary. Brenda then gave a long, rambling president's report, highlighting the success of her beautification committee and reminding everyone of the importance of following the rules to maintain our elite community standards. Finally, she arrived at my item. She sighed theatrically. "And now," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "we have our last agenda item, Mr. Henry Miller has some concerns he'd like to share about the board's procedures." She gave a tight, humorless smile to the room. "The floor is yours, Henry. Please try to be brief." This was my cue. I calmly walked to the front of the room, carrying my laptop. "Thank you, Madam President," I said, my voice even and steady. I connected my laptop to the projector the library provided. "Good evening, everyone. For those who don't know me, my name is Henry Miller. I've lived on Crestview Lane for 15 years. My professional background is in civil engineering, specifically municipal planning and contract oversight. I believe in well-run systems. Recently, I became concerned that our community's system, this HOA, was not being run as efficiently or ethically as it should be, so I did what I was trained to do. I undertook an audit." A murmur went through the room. Brenda's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. The first slide appeared on the screen behind me. It was the title, A Review of Board Fiduciary Duty and Asset Management. It looked official. It looked serious. "I won't be brief," I said, looking directly at Brenda, "but I will be factual." I started slowly, methodically. I began with the pattern of selective enforcement, showing a chart of violation notices issued over the past year. The data clearly showed a massive spike in our quadrant of the neighborhood immediately following the incident with my son. I didn't editorialize, I just presented the data. Next, I moved to procedural violations. I put up a slide detailing the state law regarding open meetings and transparent record-keeping. I quoted directly from the HOA bylaws. Then I displayed the unanimous voting records from the minutes, and I shared the testimony without naming names of former board members who confirmed that all substantive decisions were made in secret, pre-meetings, rendering the official meetings a complete sham. The mood in the room was shifting. People were sitting up straighter, leaning forward. Brenda's face was hardening, the condescending mask beginning to crack. Then, I moved to the financials. The board's primary responsibility is its fiduciary duty to us, the homeowners, I said. That means managing our money responsibly. I found some irregularities. I put up a slide showing the line item for seasonal landscaping enhancements and the total paid out over 3 years, $82,450. Then, I put up the invoices from Brenda's Beautiful Blooms. This company, I explained, has been the sole recipient of these funds. I was curious about them, as I'd never seen their trucks in the neighborhood. My next slide was a screenshot from the state's business registry. It showed the sole proprietor of Brenda's Beautiful Blooms, Brenda Tillotson. A collective gasp swept through the room. It was audible, a sharp intake of breath from 50 people at once. I turned to Brenda. Brenda, your maiden name is Tillotson, is it not? She was sheet white. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Her enablers on the board stared at their hands, at the ceiling, anywhere but at the crowd. At this time, I announced, my friends will be distributing a summary of my findings to every homeowner present. On cue, George and Maria stood up and began handing out the dossiers. It was a brilliant tactical move. Now the evidence was physically in everyone's hands. But I wasn't done. For the grand finale, I brought up the illegal gazebo. My final slide was a split screen. On the left was the official county surveyor's plat map, with a public utility easement clearly marked in red. On the right was a beautiful, sun-drenched photo of Brenda's prize-winning gazebo, taken from the HOA's own newsletter, sitting directly inside the red zone. This structure, I said, my voice echoing in the stunned silence, represents a flagrant violation of county building codes and an illegal encroachment on a public easement. It is an unmitigated liability. If the utility company needs access, they will tear it down, and we, the homeowners, could be forced to pay for the demolition and any associated fines. The board, under President Brenda's leadership, has knowingly exposed every single person in this room to significant financial and legal risk, all while our president was paying herself with our money for services that were never rendered. I turned off the projector. I looked at Brenda. Her face was a frozen mask of shock, fury, and utter humiliation. The queen had been dethroned in her own court, and the peasants were holding the receipts. The room was no longer silent. It was beginning to boil. The silence that followed my final slide lasted for about 5 seconds. It was a heavy, profound silence, the kind that precedes a storm. Then, the room erupted. It wasn't just murmuring, it was a cacophony of outrage. People were on their feet, shouting questions, waving the dossiers I had provided. "Is this true, Brenda?" someone yelled from the back. $80,000? Another voice cried out, laced with disbelief. "My fees paid for your fake company?" Brenda was paralyzed. She sat bolt upright in her chair, her face a ghastly shade of pale, her eyes darting around the room as if looking for an escape route that didn't exist. Her carefully constructed world of petty rules and absolute authority had been publicly and comprehensively demolished in the span of 15 minutes. Her board cronies looked like they wanted the floor to swallow them whole. The nervous treasurer, Arthur, was actually sweating through his shirt. Her husband, a portly man who usually remained silent at these meetings, stood up. "Now, hold on a minute," he boomed, trying to project an authority he didn't possess. "There are explanations for all of this. This is a personal attack, a smear campaign." But his voice was drowned out by the homeowners. They had the evidence in their hands. They had seen the business registration, the invoices, the surveyor's map. His blustering was useless against the cold, hard facts. This was the moment we had planned for. Through the chaos, George stood up. He was no longer the meek gentleman who was afraid of being fined for his bird feeder. He stood tall, his voice clear and steady. "Point of order, Madam President," he called out, his voice cutting through the noise. Brenda just stared at him, unblinking. George continued, citing the exact bylaw Maria had found. "According to Bylaw Section 8, Paragraph 4, any homeowner can call for a vote of no confidence in the board or any of its members if there is evidence of gross negligence or malfeasance. I believe we have seen sufficient evidence of both tonight." The room went quiet again, everyone turning to look at George. "Therefore," he declared, "I move for an immediate vote of no confidence in President Brenda, and a subsequent vote to remove the entire sitting board for their complicity and failure in their fiduciary duty to this community." "Seconded," Maria yelled from the other side of the room before George had even finished his sentence. Brenda finally found her voice. It was a shrill, desperate shriek. "You can't do that. This is not on the agenda. This is illegal." "Actually, Brenda, it is," Maria said, standing up. "The bylaws allow for it, and the motion was properly made and seconded. We need to vote." Now, as a paralegal, her confidence was unshakable, and it swayed the few people on the fence. What followed was controlled chaos. Brenda tried to adjourn the meeting, but the homeowners shouted her down. Her attempt to wield the gavel was ignored. A retired teacher in the front row, Mrs. Gable, calmly volunteered to tally the votes. People raised their hands. The vote of no confidence in Brenda was nearly unanimous. I counted only 3 hands that didn't go up: Brenda's, her husband's, and Arthur's. The subsequent vote to remove the entire board passed by a similar margin. In the space of 5 minutes, Brenda's reign was officially over. She and her cronies were powerless, sitting at the front table like defendants who had just heard the guilty verdict. An interim board was elected on the spot, composed of George, Maria, and a few other trusted, level-headed homeowners. They asked me to serve, but I politely declined. "I'm better as an advisor," I said. "My work here is done." My project was the demolition, not the reconstruction. The new board did not mess around. The very next day, armed with my comprehensive dossier, they met with a lawyer who specialized in HOA law. On his advice, they turned over all the evidence of financial crimes: the fake company, the invoices, the bank transfers to the local district attorney's office. An official investigation was launched into Brenda for felony embezzlement. The fallout was swift and spectacular. A "for sale" sign appeared in Brenda's beige and white yard less than a week later. Her pristine white Lexus, a vehicle she drove as if it were a chariot of the gods, was quietly replaced by a much more modest sedan before disappearing entirely. The crown jewel of her humiliation came when the city, alerted by the new board, sent an official crew to supervise the demolition of her illegal gazebo. The cost of the teardown was billed directly to her, a bill the new board's lawyer made sure was ironclad. Facing a mountain of irrefutable evidence, Brenda ultimately pleaded guilty to a lesser charge of theft by deception to avoid a drawn-out trial and likely jail time. She was sentenced to 5 years of probation and, most satisfyingly, was ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA for every single dollar she had stolen, $82,450, plus interest and penalties. With the tyrant gone, the neighborhood began to heal. The new board, led by George and Maria, was a model of transparency. They held open meetings where debate was encouraged. They hired a legitimate accounting firm. They slashed the annual fees by nearly 30%, proving that most of the budget had simply been padding for Brenda's slush fund. The oppressive atmosphere lifted. People started talking to each other again. The community, for the first time in years, actually felt like one. A few months later, my son David came home for another visit. He pulled his F-150 up to the curb and parked it in the exact same spot. We sat on the front porch, drinking iced tea and watching the sun set over a neighborhood that was finally at peace. I told him the whole story, from the mailbox fine to the final vote. He listened intently, a slow grin spreading across his face. He shook his head, a look of amused admiration in his eyes. "You know, Dad," he said, "I've seen fortified compounds taken down with less planning than that." He took a sip of his tea. "Never pick a fight with a civil engineer. They know where all the structural weaknesses are." And he was right. It was never about the gnome or the grass or even the insult to my son. It was about order. It was about a system that had been corrupted and needed to be corrected. Brenda built her little empire on a foundation of arrogance and sloppy lies. And like any poorly constructed edifice, it didn't need a battering ram to bring it down. It just needed a patient man with a blueprint to find the load-bearing wall and give it one precise, well-aimed push. Let me know in the comments what you would have done. And take it from me, always, always read the fine print.